About a year ago, I started collecting recorded one-on-one interviews with people in our community talking about what gay life was like from the 1930s through today. And when I was doing that, I was amazed at people's stories, and I wanted to find a way for people to be able to share their stories, our stories, with each other. And what I came up with was putting together two different panel discussions, tonight being the second. Tonight's topic probably could be summarized best as activists and agitators. Who you're going to hear from tonight and who you're going to hear about tonight are the people that were the early activists here in Columbus who were making things happen, who were holding the politicians' feet to the fire, who were organizing the groups and organizations that survive today that have advanced our community so much. I want to introduce you just real quickly to the panel. First here on the end is Chris Cozad. Next to her is Linda Schuler. In the center is Elliot Fishman. Next to him is Dan Willis. And finally on the end is Doug Whaley, who is also serving as tonight's moderator. And with that, I'll turn it over to Doug.
Thank you, Rob. I'm going to suggest to the people up here that as the first time you speak, if you'll stand up so people in the back can get some idea of what you all look like, and it's a handsome crowd anyway. So, this is the 25th anniversary of Stonewall. It started in September of 1981, and we'll talk about that as we move along. But what I'd like to start each of the panelists talking about is how they got to 1981. How they figured out they were gay and what kinds of reactions they had to the situation that was there in 1981. And then we'll take into the formation of Stonewall, and we'll tell stories about all of these people up here. And let's start with you, Chris. Get up and talk to us about yourself.
Okay, well, let's see. Gosh. I moved to Columbus in 1981, actually, from Wheeling, West Virginia. I came out when I was in college. And really, my earliest ties were to the feminist community and the women's movement and women's causes, Women Against Rape, the Women's Action Collective, Women's Music Union. I was very involved in women's music and things in those early days. And as life went on, two things happened that kind of changed the direction that I was going. And one was personal, and one was more global. Personally, my partner Gloria and I, who have been together almost 25 years, lived in a neighborhood where we had a lot of ongoing neighborhood harassment from a bunch of thugs across the street, calling us dykes, and our younger daughter, who's now 31, for those of you who don't know us for a while, was 7, I think, at the time, and she was afraid to ride her bike on the street, and we really felt very sort of terrorized and trapped in our own home. And at one point, we caught them vandalizing our home, called the police. And the one guy who was kind of the lead thug was out of prison and on parole. And so we knew that if we pushed it, that he would go back to jail. And the cop, Columbus City Police, said to us, "You don't want to do that, because yes, he'll go back to jail, but then his brothers and their friends are going to make it even worse for you. I suggest you move." And that was the sum total of the help that we got. So after a night of drinking on the porch, we painted a 5-foot purple Labrador on our front porch. It took 4 coats of paint.
We didn't have a paintbrush.
We didn't have a paintbrush. It was an interesting evening. But that really, we were really angered at the lack of help and that whole situation. So that was kind of the personal story that got us started. And then on a more global note, what really happened that kicked us in the butt was the AIDS epidemic. And our friends were dying way too regularly. And so there were a bunch of us, Jane in the back there, and I and Gloria and a few other women organized a group called Blood Sisters. And it was really the first time for lots of lesbians to have done anything in any kind of conjunction with gay men. And it was a blood drive, because it was right after they said gay men couldn't give blood anymore, and there were massive blood shortages, and these little chapters of Blood Sisters were cropping up all over. And so it was about lesbians donating blood in solidarity for our gay friends that were dying. And that was really what moved me into working in the gay and lesbian community. And I saw in so many communities that the men and the women didn't really get along, they didn't really work together, there was not any sort of sense of community or solidarity, and that was something that really irritated me at the time. And so I put a lot of my personal energy and a lot of my personal relationships and friendships dragging people from both sides, kicking and screaming, to the table. And I like to think that that has something to do with the reputation that we have as a city now in terms of the community being very homogenous and not just being, here are the lesbians over here and here are the gay men over here and never the twain shall meet. So that's how I got started. I'll stop there.
Okay. Linda, there's an extra seat up here too if someone doesn't want to stand. I hate to see it go to waste. Linda.
Well, I'm ashamed to say that I was a little late coming out, and so while these women were out doing all those wonderful things, I was hiding in the closet somewhere, so I have to admit that to you. However, better late than never. Since 1998, I have been working my butt off. So I'm trying to make up for all the times that I was missing. I feel bad about that. I guess that's a story that I share probably with some people. I started to realize that there was something different about me when I was about 18 and I was at OSU. So I went up in the stacks in Arts Hall and I thought, well, this gay thing, I think that's what I am and I need to go up here and read about it. And if you remember, until 1974 or so, we were considered to be deviant. So that was the part I was reading about. And I'd go up in the stacks and read about it and I'd go, I don't really think I'm that deviant. and then I read the part about how all gay people seem to know each other, but they don't know how they know each other. And so I thought, well, maybe if I go over to the bar across the street. What was the bar across the street that was so wild on OSU campus?
Larry's.
Larry's. I thought, I'll go over to Larry's and see if I can figure out who the gay people are. So I have no idea. I walked out. Kind of hung with my groups for a while. And, but you know, I was talking to a young friend of mine, and he was mentioning that Fred and Howard had a big impact on him. And I thought it was kind of interesting because Fred was saying how he wasn't out, he didn't feel that people had actually, that he had maybe made much of an impact. And so Dean was saying, he made a big impact on me. I was 15 when I came to Columbus. It was nice to know there was a Fred and a Howard. So I guess in some retrospect, I have to think about, in 1969 I started working for the Recreation and Parks Department at Whetstone Recreation Center, and my kids and I created Park Playhouse and Children's Drama Company. And it was a good time because for young artists, there really wasn't an identity. Well, of course, all my boys were gay, and I think probably a few of my girls were too. So in that sense, I had the little kaleidoscope club going. and actually, Craig Huffman was one of my kids. So it was kind of cute because he sent me a little note saying that I was his first crush. Well, I was a crush on a lesbian. I guess that's what happened to him. Being one of the movers and shakers. But that was a great experience for me, and I think I loved being in the arts with the kids. And so that's kind of where I am. And then I guess I'll stop there too.
Okay, well, we'll get back to everybody, but again, I'm getting up to 1981 when Elliot was a baby.
I was. In 1981 was the year I started law school, in the fall of 1981, and for that I was I wasn't out until my senior year in college at Miami University, and I dated women, and like so many of you, first time I had a sexual encounter with a man, I thought, that's what's missing. That was, I think so many of us had that can remember that aha moment. And from there, it was, was no problem for me personally. But I was still very, in the early 1980s, it was still a very scary time to be gay. And Chris told you some of the stories, and I think all of us heard stories, and Anita Bryant was still very fresh in our minds, and there was a lot of things that made it very scary to be gay or lesbian. And so I came to law school with a lot of trepidation, not knowing, first of all, finally being comfortable with myself and my own sexual orientation, but not understanding how that was going to play out in terms of my law school or my career. So what happened was, I'm going to tell a little story on Doug here, and then later in a minute, one on Rhonda Rivera as well. But there was a woman who sat in back of me. In law school, in first year, you have sections that you kind of travel with to each of your classes, the same people in each of your classes, and you usually sit alphabetically. So there was a woman who sat in the row in back of me. Her name was Yvette Lutman. And Yvette Lutman and I would kind of turn around and always, we kind of got the eye for each other, figured out that we were gay and lesbian, and always chatted with each other. And we came out to each other, and one day she said to me, "Are you going to the party this Saturday?" And I said, "Party? What party?" She said, "Professor Rivera, Professor Whaley are having a party for the gay and lesbian law students." I didn't know anything about it. And she said, "Would you like to go?" I said, "Sure." She said, "Well, there's one catch. It's by invitation only, and we have to go see Professor Whaley, who was actually our professor who was teaching us property law at the time." And so Yvette took me up to Professor Whaley's office, and Doug was very imposing and behind his desk. And of course, I was his little first-year law student. I was all of 21 years old. And I'm sitting there with Yvette, and Yvette says, "Professor Whaley, you know Elliot." "Yes, I know Mr. Fishman." "Well, it's about the party this weekend." "Yes." "Well, we were wondering if Elliot could come to the party too." "Yes." "Well, it's by invitation only, right?" "Yes." And there was this silence, and Doug said, "So, Mr. Fishman, why do you think you should come to this party?" He wasn't going to let me off the hook at all. I, of course, am sinking lower and lower. Mostly intimidated because here's this law professor, Finally, there was just dead silence, and it was very uncomfortable. And Doug said, "Let me make it easy for you. Do you qualify for the party?" Doug said, "Fine." And then he turned to Yvette and said, "Tell Rhonda I win." Because he and Rhonda were having a contest to see how many gay men and how many lesbians they could get to come to the party. So that was my coming out in law school. And my coming out politically was with Rhonda Rivera, who most of you I think know or have heard of. Rhonda, after this party and after a little while in law school, I went up to Rhonda, I went down to her office and I said to her, "I'd like to volunteer for this organization I hear you're organizing called Stonewall Union." And she said, "Oh, what would you like to do?" And I said, "Well, I don't know if it's of any help, but when I was in college I was involved with United Jewish Appeal and I learned how to do fundraising." Well, the dollar sign splashed in her eyes, and she said, "Oh, great, we'll make you the chair of the Financial Development Committee. We'll put you on the board, and don't worry, it'll only be one meeting a month." which I call the greatest lie Rhonda ever told.
And she told it repeatedly.
Many of us here were victims of the one meeting a month lie that Rhonda told. I have one other very short story to tell you, and that's about my personal coming out with my parents, because I think it says a lot about how far we've come. I came out to my parents right as I was finishing law school because I knew I was going to be staying here in Columbus, and I wanted to be comfortable with them. And I, of course, I was out, with friends and everything like that, but I hadn't come out to them. So one night I went home and I sat down with them and I said, "I need to talk to you about something." And they knew what was going on. And my dad got up, and I remember it was in the summer, and I remember he got up and closed the door like there was, so the neighbors wouldn't hear this discussion. And I told them, and they were at the time they were great, but at that moment. But in the aftermath, my mother didn't speak to me for probably 6 months. My father, to my great surprise, was very accepting and said, "You're my son, I love you, this is okay, we're gonna have to work on your mother." And so my mother really had struggled with it a lot. She had, as with so many of our parents, she had, a particular vision of what I was going to be like, and that was married to a woman with children. And she wanted me to marry a nice Jewish girl, and later I told her I'd have 2 out of 3. Nice and Jewish. But she didn't speak to me very long and really struggled with it for years. I have to tell you that now she and my stepdad, my dad died a number of years ago, she and my stepdad live in Florida, and she is very active with the PFLAG chapter in Naples, and has actually done a great deal of work bridging the gap between the Jewish community and the gay and lesbian community in Southwest Florida. So, this gives you a little example of how far we've come.
Dan.
Well, I'm going to defer all the funny stories to these people. But when Rob mentioned activists and stuff, I thought I was never really an activist. I always was somebody who worked for the state forever. I started in '71 and knew I was gay for a very long time. And I dated the same guy after 6th grade and after 7th grade. But yeah, we kind of knew something was there. And then I dated women and dated men and that kind of thing. But for me, my dad always was big on getting a job, because at the time it was very difficult for minorities to get and keep jobs. And a government job, a railroad job, a postal job was a good job that he knew that I would always be taken care of. I think as I look back on it now, I think the times were different. My dad might have been out. He never said anything, but what he didn't say, that meant so much. So as a result, my focus was always working for the state. Getting a job, being visible, being thought of as somebody of value in the company. Because what happened was in the state, and probably in a lot of other private companies too, there were two things going on if you were a minority, or if you were a woman for that matter, and you were gay and lesbian, that people just didn't see you. You just didn't really exist. You were there, you were a body that took form, but that was about it. Even with the laws in '64 and '65 and '68 for voting and housing and civil rights and equal opportunity and stuff, people's thoughts didn't change. And in a lot of respects, they still haven't changed. So I thought I would do, since my job was kind of critical and I didn't want to lose my job, there was a time when it was very easy for me to get arrested, which I was in jail one time, but I wasn't arrested. It was for an FBI clearance for my job. That was the only place they would accept fingerprints. And the guy was about that tall, and his arms were about as big as my thighs. He says, "Don't move from the line." I said, "Don't worry, I won't." But my focus was trying to do what my dad always said to do, is get the job, keep a good job, and make a presence in the job. And I found that in the job, I found other gay people and lesbian people that we kind of talked. And we thought it was important that by our actions that we set an example in state government, that we are here, we are productive, and can lead, and we can teach. I was a trainer for a very long time. And that was always my focus. And I would be honest with you, I was always very scared to be in the street. I worked for Governor Celeste for 8 years, at a time when we were very, very cautious about how the press viewed us at the time. This is long before other issues came out in the press. But we worked very hard at doing our job from the inside. And so that was always my focus. It always has been. So I never was really a street person or activist in that respect, but within government, that was my focus. I thought it was important to learn how to do a job well.
Say a few words about bartending at Ties and what that was like in those days.
Thank you.
We're working towards 81 prior to that. So.
Downtown Columbus, I think was it Town and High? Was it Town and High?
The city center's on top.
City Center. There was an ice skating rink there. Remember?
Yes.
Okay, before the ice skating rink, there was a bar there that in the front of it was a furniture store that faced High Street. And then on the back side of it was Ties. And Ties was one of the premier bars in town. At a time when you went to the Cat's Meow, you could get beat up very easily. It's the old Flatiron building downtown. That's what that used to be. A lot of the bars were very seedy. They were German Villas, not the garage, but what was it? Grotto. There were locals down there that you had to be very careful of. There was Tiny's, where the woman who ran it, her husband worked for the police department. It was really kind of strange. And costume people would serve you breakfast at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. It's a lot of fun. But Ties was the premier place. This is where you would go, if you had a Halloween party, you would go there and show off how well you were dressed. People would come in furs, they would come in tuxes, they would come in with a limo. And it was the place to go. We would celebrate football parties on weekends. Whenever OSU was playing, we could throw on the jersey and put the stuff on your eyes, you know. And as I was telling Rob before, I think that's what kind of stopped me from drinking so much, because you have to watch your money. That's the important thing when you work in a bar. It was a great time to meet a lot of people. Enjoyed it very much. The owner's Ties, I think it was David, had 2 bars, one in Dayton, and then Ties was here in Columbus. So it was a lot of fun to work there.
Okay.
What's that?
My story, first of all, I'm older than everybody here probably combined, so I have a long, complicated story. I was an Air Force brat and all of that, and I have a more complicated coming out story than we have time for, but for very complicated reasons, I did not know, though I suspected, that I was gay until I was married and a father. And finally, actually, I suppose I ought to say this, marijuana is what brought me out. I owe great debt to marijuana. I discovered it when I was in my early 30s. My ex-wife was quite a hippie, and she's the one who introduced me to it. And with marijuana, you can concentrate on one thing at a time. And it might be the hairs on the inside of your nostrils, or it might be whether or not you've been lying to yourself all your life. And I've been sleeping with women that meant I was straight. And I don't mean to offend anybody like this, because it's not most people's experience, it's just mine. I've always thought about sleeping with women the same way I think of bowling. It's something I can do, that I enjoy. I was once in 2 leagues. That I was even good at. And if I never do it again, I don't care. But I was trying to pretend that bowling was the most important thing in the world, and at some point I came to and I said to my wife, here's what the problem is, and we are still good friends. We had some rocky periods, but she's coming up next month to spend the weekend. I said to her, here's what the problem is, and I was teaching law at Indiana. It has 2 law schools, one in Indianapolis, one down in Bloomington, and the one in Indianapolis where I started. And Ohio State had made me an offer to become a visiting professor for the 2 quarters that started in January of '76. So I said to her, I didn't know whether to take this. She said, Doug, take it and explore, because it would be an awful thing to be a homosexual and never act upon it in any way. So I came here to come out, and I never, of course, went back in, and that led to divorce and all of that. And the first thing I did was I wanted to go to a gay bar. I thought, how do you find a gay bar? And I didn't have a clue. I was 34. And so I got the yellow pages out, and I'm actually sort of proud of this. I looked under cocktail lounges, found one on Gay Street. I knew it wouldn't be a gay bar, and I called him. I said, is this a gay bar? And he said, no. I said, what's the name of the gay bar? He said, the Kismet. I said, thank you. So I looked up the Kismet in the phone book and figured out where it is. It's now the Columbus Eagle. And on a Friday night at 8 o'clock, I went there. Fellini could have passed his movies. Out of the 6 people nearest the door, and there were only about 8 in the place, in the Kismet in those days at 8 o'clock. So then I learned about things like the wall, and I found Ties. And I'm not sure if Dan and I met in this period, but this is 76, 77, what should we call it? The Robert Haverkamp calls it the no standards period. Many of us went through, this is pre-AIDS, and it was a pretty exciting time, and I ran into all the gay law students. One guy turned around one time at the bar, he had 2 drinks, and he saw me and dropped both his drinks. So that brings, and I came out, I got divorced, and I started looking around at what was happening to us, and I was angry. And I think that's the reaction of many people in this room. Now, for those of us who are older, the first reaction had to be gay, and one of the reasons I suppressed it was shame. But I overcame shame, and then I was angry. And I wanted to get involved in whatever was going on. Now, the 3 people who are mentioned in the book who started Stonewall, Craig Covey, Val Thogmartin, and Craig Huffman, in September or August of 1981, 25 years ago, Jerry Falwell was trying to get a moral majority chapter started here in Columbus. And it was a big deal in the press and so forth. So various liberal people of all kinds got together to stop it. And this was highly successful. He was never able to start a moral majority chapter here in Columbus. But 3 of these people were gay. I assume more were, but the 3 who formed Stonewall were Craig Covey, who was its first president and executive director, and Val Thogmartin, who was the assistant and was the associate president of the organization in those days, and Craig Huffman, who was our bomb thrower. They said, we need a gay group. Now, they had all been involved in Gay Activists Alliance, which was one of those organizations formed more or less nationwide and spontaneously after the Stonewall riots in June of 1969. Now, at the last panel last week, those riots were sort of poo-pooed as having an influence here in Columbus, but I think it's a mistake to see it in that way. There's a wonderful book, David Carter, is that it, Rob? Called Stonewall, that everybody in the room should go on to Amazon.com tonight and order. Stonewall by David Carter, that you read it and the tears pour down your cheeks and you think, God, those people were brave. And even though it wasn't a big deal in Columbus, we didn't even hear about it for all I know, it started people fighting all over. And this is the baby boomer generation. The women were suddenly doing things, and the African American community had been the lead on how the kind of civil rights you could push for, and eventually gay civil rights was there, and they started the Gay Liberation Front, and that was way too radical. Then there was the Gay Activists Alliance, and Ohio State had one. Craig Covey was its president. And then activists sounded too big, so they changed to the Gay Alliance. But once they were all out of Ohio State, they wanted to start a new organization, so they decided, Val suggested the name, Stonewall Union. It eventually became Stonewall Columbus. But years and years after, there's even a funny story there I'll have to tell sometime. And they decided they needed members, so they went to all the bars and they put up flyers, and the bars had a new organization going, and Val was in a booth in Trends one night, and actually, I know it was October 3rd, I keep a diary. It was October 3rd, 1981, and I walked in the bar, and Val was sitting there, new sign, new political organization. I said, sign me right up. He said, we're having our organizational meeting next week. I said, I'll come to that too. So I signed up and we went to the first meeting. Now, but this time, these 3 people had dragged in their then partners, one of whom is the Keith McKnight, who's mentioned in the back of the book. He and Val were lovers in those days. And the partners, whether they wanted to or not, had to do lots of things with Stonewall. And some of them, Keith did some wonderful work, Dennis Below, and Steve Wilson, who was our treasurer for many years. We owe an awful lot to Steve, and he was a kid. I mean, he couldn't have been more than 14. No, I'm kidding, but he was still working his way through OSU, so he wasn't very old at all, and he was real good. He got us our first computer at Stonewall. So I was on the first board, and then we had our first parade in 1982, the following year, but this is the 25th parade. It's the 24th anniversary, but it's the 25th parade. And we were terrified no one would come. In November of '81, we threw a press party at my house. We invited all the members of the press, new gay organizations starting to come, and we were promised that the media would send representatives. There were the television and the radio and the Columbus Dispatch and so forth. So we got all dolled up and cleaned up and so forth. And Rhonda Rivera had joined the OSU faculty in September of '81. Suddenly I had all these gay law students in my office pointing like bird dogs. Lesbian. So Rhonda and I became good friends just last night. I told the story of our meeting, so I'll not repeat that here. But she and I became good friends, and I asked her if she'd come to the press party. She said, of course she would. And it was a big coup to catch Rhonda Rivera, because eventually, as many of you in the room know, she took over the community. And the story about her bullying Elliot in, she bullied almost all of us in. Last night I said, you know, you had to do what Rhonda said. But in any event, she was much more meek in 1976, though the meek period passed. We threw that press party at my house, and not a single representative of the press showed. No one. So we got drunk and had one hell of a party, but it was very disappointing. Then we decided we're going to hold a pride parade at the end of June of '82, and we were terrified no one would come. And so we sent out flyers and contacted all the gay organizations, and we begged and pleaded, and hoped and crossed our fingers. We were scared it was going to be 30 people, us and all our friends. You know, and the Stonewall Union existed really only as names. You know, we were constantly in people's houses, sitting on floors because there weren't enough chairs. Craig Covey's apartment on 8th, right up here. The reason Stonewall's phone number is 299-7764 is that was Craig Covey's number. And we'd sit there on the floor covered in cat hair and try to get stamps and so on. Elliot's arrival was wonderful. We used to send him out to beat the bushes. And so anyway, we were afraid about the very first parade, and 825 people showed up. We know because we counted them. And there is a video of the parade, and I got it. Stonewall asked me to do a retrospective on the history of gay rights, and I put it on in 2008, and I got out all the videos, and we turned that presentation into a DVD, and Stonewall and its library here has got 2 copies, and that one really shows all these things. And there's a bit of the parade in there, and I got it out in 2003 when I was getting this presentation ready, and I sat there and I watched the parade, and tears streamed down my cheeks. I was so proud of those people. It was dangerous to be walking down the street, and physically dangerous, and lose your job and lose your family, kind of dangerous. There were some people, not many, the papers said there were quite a bit, but there were some people marching in paper bags. And we got to the rally, and there was a local politician. I keep meaning to ask what his name was. He was wonderful, and he was a straight man, and he was in the Ohio legislature and the Senate. Mike Schwarzwald. Oh, and he's a good-looking guy too. And he got up and he spoke. That was a brave act because it could be political suicide in those days. Were you in that first parade? Did you march?
No, I didn't march.
Anybody marched? I asked. And Rob, as a young teenager, stood on the sidewalk and watched it go by. He was telling me. So the parade was a huge success. And for those of us who started with 825, to look at what's going to happen on Saturday is a miracle. Now, we had some other battles that, again, we don't have time to talk about a lot of them, but the battle to get an ordinance down at City Council was one of the major ones. By this time, Rhonda had taken over the organization, and we all did what Rhonda told us to do, and she said it was time to get an ordinance down at City Council that would protect us. And we had promises from the politicians. The vote was going to be 5-2 in favor of the ordinance. And Jerry Hammond, who is one of those many straight people to whom the gay community owes an awful lot, was president of City Council, and he introduced it and he fought for it. But we were so naive. We had no idea the storm that we were unleashing. They bussed people in from churches from all over central and southern Ohio and filled the room. We were outnumbered 2-1 in that room, and it was a dangerous atmosphere with people chanting and waving their Bibles and so forth, and people up there with, you mustn't put lepers among God's clean people. And the ministers saying to the council, you're committing political suicide if you vote for that. Well, we thought the vote was going to be 5-2, and it was. But it was 5-2 against this, including the 2 Republican women on council who had both promises they were going to support it. But at the last moment, they both chickened out. And one of them was Arlene Shoemaker, and she was county commissioner not that long ago. And she'd promised she was going to support the gay community, and Craig Covey had helped get her elected and all of that. And at the last moment, she got up and she said, I have to explain my vote. And Rhonda was talking last night about this. She makes an unfortunate slip of the tongue as she explains it. She said, I have to vote against it because it's not queer-cut, clear-cut. We eventually got that ordinance through, but not that time. Now, out of defeats, however, we were depressed. Out of defeats come great victories, too. People were suddenly hugely activated to do something about what happened at City Council, and it was on all the TV and they kept replaying it on the public access channel, hours of it, and all these people waving their Bible. And Stonewall suddenly got this huge lift of people contributing money and time and so forth. And from that moment on, unlike the very early years, we were in no danger of folding. This organization almost folded 50 times in the early years, sometimes clash of personalities, but typically it was money. And but for Elliot, it wouldn't be standing here these days. I sent him out to talk to the A-gays, the ones who had all the money. They didn't want Stonewall. They were, Rhonda once gave a speech in which she said when she got here, The men and the women were divided into two groups. Men, it was a social group. I wanted desperately to get to one of Orrin Huntington's parties. He was here last week talking about that sort of thing. I knew that would mean. And when we say social, we mean sexual. The women, on the other hand, this was the height of the women's movement. The women were trying to run meetings without Robert's Rules of Order because it was patriarchal. Rhonda said the men were trying to find climax and the women were trying to find consensus. What brought us together was the Stonewall from the very beginning wanted to be gender inclusive. The first three presidents of the board, one was male and the next two were female. The third was Rhonda, and after that the organization was off and running. The Pride March in '84, when we had this big battle, was something else to see too, and that was a fine one. We ended up on the State House lawn. Now, we eventually got the ordinance through City Council. We'll talk about that, how that happened. Elliot and Chris and all those were involved in those. But let's move on to other people talking about these early days. And Elliot, I want to move to you first, because you're involved from almost the very beginning there, and then we'll move to Chris, and we'll then move to Dan and Linda.
Let me just talk about the stories.
Yeah, stories.
Chris, jump in at the meantime. First of all, I want to say,
In fact, all of us should jump in at this point.
I just want to tell you that something remarkable that Doug just told the story about what happened at City Council in 1984, and the chief minister who led the troops into City Hall was none other than Rod Parsley. Very young Rod Parsley, but it was none other than Rod Parsley.
I didn't know that.
So, and if you see, there's a video. I think Rob has found a copy of it somewhere called "You Can't Fight." Oh, you can't fight City Hall. It documents what happened.
Vivian Schaefer, who was the president of Stonewall at one point along the way there.
That's right. Vivian Schaefer did that. We there were so many stories, but one of the things I remember about the city council fight, or the city council ordinance, was that Rhonda was passing out pink triangles to our supporters, and a woman walked in, and Rhonda says she was clearly part of the polyester patrol, as she put it. But Rhonda went to see if she would take a pink triangle, and she said, "What is that for?" And Rhonda explained to her that pink triangle was what the Nazis used to designate homosexuals in the death camps and concentration camps, and it's a symbol of hate. She said, "Well, I don't want one of those." And Rhonda said, "Well, surely you don't believe people should be put to death." And the woman looked right at Rhonda in the eye and said, "You should be."
Oh.
So you can see how difficult those times were.
Rhonda had bodyguards as she left that meeting.
Yeah. And her son spoke.
Oh, that was one of the most touching things I've ever seen in my life.
A couple of other things that happened that come to mind. One is that, and I think Doug and Chris both mentioned it, is the fact that men and women work together. And that was really Rhonda's, and she's sort of the ghost in the room here, but one of the geniuses of Stonewall was that Rhonda said, when she was asked to be on the board, she said, "I want to have gender parity on the board." And that really forced Stonewall to have a board of half men and half women. And I was on that early board, and Chris was too. And it really forced us to learn a lot about each other because, as Doug just pointed out, we had very different cultures, and we still do this to a great extent. But we learned about each other's culture. It really forced us to really sit down and learn about each other, and learn about patriarchal systems and women understanding about gay men and how our views on sex, which was very eye-opening to a lot of people. But it really forced us to work together, and it was a remarkable thing. It really was, and one of the things that came out of it was that the women in our community really took care of us in so many respects when many of us got sick and were dying. And to me, I think it was blood sisters, it was legal help, it was serving as volunteers. That to me was the symbol of how men and women in our community worked together, and was just it was a remarkable occurrence.
Say a few words too about raising money with the A-gays and all of that.
Yes. Well, and so I have to bring in another name from our past who's no longer with us, Dennis Cox, who some of you know. Dennis was, when Rhonda made me chair of the Financial Development Committee, she also gave me a committee. She gave me committee members, one of whom was a man by the name of Dennis Cox, who was a hairdresser in town. He owned his own hair salon. And he was
Rhonda's hairdresser.
He was Rhonda's hairdresser, which is how she 4
meetings a year, she told me.
Dennis later became president of Stonewall.
Story.
And Dennis was the party guy. I mean, that was, you know, anything for a party, any excuse for a party. I mean, one of Dennis's great parties, a social party, was what he called the hats and heels party. He and his partner Robert had a pool in their house, in back of their house in German Village. Think about that. And they would every year have this party where you had to come in hats and heels. And you know, some people came in hard hats and and work shoes, but most people came in hats and heels. But Dennis was the one who really kind of helped get the party. I mean, he had a lot of connections with the gay community, and so he was the one who sort of he opened a lot of doors, and he'd invite people over, he'd have parties, and everything was a party to him. He wanted to have these fun, and he decided we should have house parties. And so we'd get people to give us house parties, to throw house parties for us. Now, my role was to actually do the asking. And because think about this, I was a 21-year-old law student. I had a lot more hair then, and so I would go, and I was pretty fearless. I'd go and if it was a party, I'd make a pitch, and if it was if it was an individual, Dennis would get me in to see Michael Jelby, who was a very wealthy member of our community, and I remember going in to see him. And basically, and talking to him about the need for Stonewall and why it was important, and said, I want you to give us a check for $1,000, which then was a huge amount of money, and then held my breath, and he wrote out a check for $1,000. He said, I was going to give you $50, but since you asked for it, he gave you $1,000. So but part of what we had to do was educate ourselves about raising money and agree that we deserve to raise money for our organizations. So whenever Stonewall was in a financial crisis, they would kind of send me off to somebody on my list to go ask for money. And Steve remembers some of those those asks as well.
Tell us about being turned down. Was it ugly?
Yes. We were turned down by a lot of people. And part of that was because Stonewall was seen as the activist organization, and a lot of the social A-gays, as it were didn't want that. I mean, they didn't want it. It was the question was, do you have to be so out there, so open? So and some of that was kind of the social norms and people wanting to maintain their social lives the way they were and not wanting to have to reach out any further. And some of it was just being very scared and closeted. At the time, Steve, I remember, was a teacher, and teachers had reason to be scared and closeted at the time. They could be fired under morals clauses. So we would go to them and talk to them about it, and we were turned down a lot, and we're told, we don't think we should have Stonewall. We just keep the things the way they are. Eventually, though, I think having HRC helped, and the AIDS epidemic helped, brought a lot of the wealthier gay men into the fold, and ultimately people were much more participatory.
Elliot, just to emphasize, if I may, the very first Human Rights Campaign Fund event in 1983, not one person wrote a check to the Human Rights Campaign Fund. People were afraid to write checks to gay organizations. I don't know whether they thought there was some little homophobe sitting at the bank looking at the checks.
That's exactly what people would say.
But that was your nervousness. And so in the beginning, it was all cash.
I don't want it to be undocumented. I don't want somebody at the bank to see my name.
And what would you then say, Elliot?
What would I then say? I would say take cash. No, I'm really serious about it. I would say we'll take cash.
Rhonda used to say you can write checks from that closet.
Write checks from the closet. That's right. That is a Rhonda Rivera-ism. One of the things, and Rhonda was really good, and she encouraged. And what we did do a lot of was talk about how we need all kinds of people in our community. We need people who are very conservative and may not want to be marching out on the streets, but we also need people who are marching out on the streets, and we need people who are going to be in the boardrooms and at the table, and we need people who are going to be on the soapbox, and that was important. Before I sit down, one other thing I want to tell us, because Steve brought up the first HRC dinner, was at the Americana apartment complex in the basement. And I, for the first maybe 3 years of HRC, I was the chair of the security committee. Now, what was the security committee about? The security committee was about keeping people, making sure that no one who wasn't invited didn't show up. So we were keeping people out of the HRC, and it was specifically to make sure that if the media showed up, that they couldn't get in and take pictures of people. And so my job was I had to hire security guards, and I had to give the security guards instructions that that if anybody from the media came, they were to come and get me right away, and keep them out. And if anybody didn't have a ticket or they didn't look appropriate, we had to zoom right there and get them. And now think about it today, we love the media. We want the media to come to our events. So think about that as a change in 25 years.
Before I move on to Chris, I have to say, in '84, after the debacle down at City Hall, and we had the very great Pride March that year, Rhonda's term was up as president of the board. And she had come in '83, and again, she was on the law school faculty, and she gathered the people around her she wanted around her. And we had a 4-hour first meeting, and it was thrilling. I hate meetings. So, and she was talking about stepping down as the president of the board. The elections were always in the fall. They still are, I assume. Kelly?
Yes.
Yes. And so in the fall of '84, she was talking about stepping down, and she wanted Dennis Cox to be the new president. Now, Dennis was a wonderful person. He is no longer with us. But he was not the appropriate person to take over the organization, in my opinion.
He was difficult.
And he said to me, late in his life, I ran into him in a bar, and we stood there and talked, and we both had a few drinks, and he said, "Doug, if I can be president of Stonewall, anybody could be president." During his presidency, which eventually did come about, he was famous for overspending his budget.
Yes, always.
And when confronted with this, he cried. So I was horrified with the idea of Dennis Cox becoming president of the board. President of the board. So Ron and I had lunch at L'Armagnac. Remember that? Restaurant. And I put her foot to the fire. I said, unless you run again, I'll run for president of the board. Now, this was a bluff, because among my talents, we do not include administrative things. I am no good at running organizations, and I have no patience for meetings, the faculty meetings at the law school. I was famous for the trouble I caused just trying to get them over. And so I was calling her bluff, and we went to lunch, and she said, "Okay, you got it." And I said, "What?" She said, "Okay, you can run, and you'll be." In the early days, it was like the Politburo, whoever was designated was coming up next. So that's how I accidentally became president of Stonewall Columbus. But now we move to Chris Cozad. Now I'm going to say some very nice things about Chris. Chris is another one of those people you do not mess with. And she has been doing all of these activist things and so forth. And when it came time for her to be president, she not only took over the organization, she was the first person to ever run it be president for 2 terms. And then there was 2.5 terms. You're on.
Well, there's so many stories I could tell with that lead-in, I'll tell you. But I want to tell us a Dennis Pride story, since it is Pride, because Dennis chaired Pride. And after I talked about our run-in with the neighbors, and I wasn't at the first Pride March, but I was at the second. And at the third, I drove a giant 1941 American LaFrance fire truck, picture. The steering wheel was about this big around, and we covered the back of the fire truck with lesbians. Hanging off the ladders, balloons, lesbians and balloons. It was big fun. And my partner was riding in the front seat with me, and it had a crank siren, and we were cranking the siren. And I was driving, because, you know, this thing did not have power steering, let me tell you. The guy who owned it, who let us drive it, said that the average size of a fireman in those days in the 40s was about 240 pounds and 6'2", because they had to be that big to be able to handle the equipment and drive the trucks and carry the hoses. It was wild. But anyway, that was just a very fun thing. So that was my second Pride March. There still were folks with bags on their heads in those days. My partner Gloria was previously married, had a young child, and an ex-husband who was threatening to sue for custody. And so she had a balloon right there at all times. And everyone on the fire truck was told, if you see the media or anyone with a camera, tell Gloria, and she would pull that balloon in front of her face. So that was my third, that was the third Pride, my second. And then the next year I volunteered. And I volunteered to do security. Imagine that. And we did that, and then the second year we did security was the year after the ordinance. And we were that year at the amphitheater on the other side of the river because something was going on at the State House. They were renovating the State House lawn or something, and we'd always been at the State House prior to that. So Dennis Cox was the chair of the event in those days. And well, the first thing he did was, you know, when I got involved, he said, "Oh, good, you're a lesbian. Find us a lesbian musician to play at the record." So we did that. And
That wouldn't have been hard.
no. But that was my sole role on the Pride Committee that first year. Well, the second year we were at the Broad Street, at the riverfront amphitheater. And there were, I'll bet, 700-800 fundamentalists on lining both sides of the Broad Street Bridge, like with their hands out, praying and speaking in tongues. As we
That was
walked,
scary.
it was very intense.
Well, how many did you just say?
I think there were 600 or 700 of them.
I heard 500, but compared to what it was before that and after that, that was the year where it was terrifying.
There was one year when they were at Broad and Hyde, that was the year before. But it was just an amazing thing in those days, and security was so important. So that was my second year on the committee, and then by the third year I was chairing the committee. I chaired Pride for 8 or 9 years. And I did a command performance back for that one year too, when one of the chairs quit at the last minute. But one of the other things that went along with that, Doug was talking about our partners, and that really hasn't changed too much. You know, we still bring our partners to everything. And Gloria would coordinate
Don't
security.
date an activist.
Gloria always coordinated security when I coordinated Pride. But in those days, security was pretty serious business because we had 700, 800, 900, 1,000 protesters. We would get bomb threats. Yeah, and you know, one of the things that we trained our volunteers is when we walked by parking garages, to look up and watch for snipers. I mean, it was a so much different experience than it is now. But that was, you know, we did that, and then the next year we were back at the State House, and then the next year we had the first Gay Fest, we called it, the Pride Festival at Bicentennial Park. Phil Piscitelli was in charge, and it was an ordeal.
Impeccable.
It was impeccable, and it poured. It poured rain. And you know, back in those days, Stonewall we did our own food, and it was called the Stonewall Inn 2, and we had hot dogs and popcorn and nachos and all this stuff. We rented all the equipment and all this food, and it was pouring rain. And I just remember Phil standing at the corner, holding the tent down, looking at all the wet hot dog buns, and just crying. It was awful. It was awful, but the next year was better, and we moved on from there.
Can I mention at the very first Pride Parade, Val Thogmartin, who is the one who named it Stonewall Union, was one of the founders, was on a rickety-made float that involved actually a stepladder, and he was up at the top with a big sign, "Join Stonewall Union." And there was some guy who started throwing eggs at him. And Val was ducking these eggs, and he saw a policeman, and he pointed to the policeman, and this guy, and the policeman walked over, and this guy had a bowl of eggs. and the policeman talking about it, and he held up the ball, and the policeman took his baton and went bam, 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 bam.
One other thing I remember very distinctly about the year at the amphitheater was the stage decoration.
Yes.
Dennis made, it must have been about 8 or 9 feet tall, silver lame Statue of Liberty.
Oh, God, yes, I
Remember?
remember.
God, those idiots. It was just awful. But that was one thing that, Doug, you led me to. The other thing was, going back to that second term of my presidency, I had elections were in September of those days, and so in September of 90, I think,
I've got the list.
I think in September of 90, I was finished with my second term. And Russ Stock was elected president. And then, a couple of months later, Russ was arrested for date rape. And what a day that was in the media.
Oh, God.
It was awful. And he called me from jail immediately and resigned.
Before calling an attorney.
Before he called an attorney, he called me and resigned.
Well, that was responsible.
It was. He was ultimately acquitted. But it was a very sensational story. It involved barbecue sauce and neckties in the bathtub. It was all very unpleasant. But what happened was the woman who was the vice president at the time, Holly Featherstone, was not, she wasn't out. She wasn't out at work, she wasn't out to her family. She couldn't deal with the media. So the first thing she did was call me and say, will you please deal with the media? I said, sure. Well, I did 29 media interviews in one day. It was the most amazing day. Baptism by fire when it comes to dealing with the media, let me tell you. And then, there was this confab meeting at the old Stonewall office over in 5th, and we called in all the old past presidents. Dennis was there, Rhonda was there.
I was there.
Doug was there.
But before you get to that, there was a further complication with Russ. He had a history, you may remember, that suddenly came out.
Right.
He had been in jail for raping.
And we
a
didn't
man.
know it.
Statutory rape of a minor in northwestern Ohio somewhere, years and years ago. So it was
And
just.
we were terrified what this would do to the organization.
Right.
Rhonda went on, we all went on television, and there's a picture of the three of us sitting there on TV at one point, and Rhonda's explaining, just because this happened to one person doesn't mean all gay people do this. Just as, and there was a scandal involving the mayor, which she got into, she didn't say his name, but she said, just as certain politicians do things with babysitters. And there was a scandal involving one of the congressmen, and she said, you don't condemn all heterosexuals for that. Rhonda could massage these things. Mm-hmm. And what I said was, if he's guilty, we're embarrassed as any organization would be. If he's not guilty, that's what we're certainly hoping for. We have a presumption of innocence. And Chris was in there, as she said, massaging. That was a real bad time.
It was. And that night of that meeting, the media was in the parking lot. And we had to lock the doors, and they kept trying to stick their cameras in the window, and we had to tape paper up over the windows so that we could have a meeting to figure out what we were going to do. And it was at that meeting that I said I would step back in as president. And Gloria offered to resign as the anti-violence coordinator because of the obvious conflict of interest. And the board said, no, absolutely not. Just stay put, we'll deal with this. But it was a very intense time. But then to, just kind of take us past that in terms of a humorous ending to the story. That was in February. Then we had our annual dinner in the fall again. And Smokey Shoemate, many of you probably remember Smokey from the AIDS Task Force, was the MC. And the board had given her specific instructions. You are not to talk about Russ, you are not to talk about the incident, do not bring it up. The first thing she did, she walked up to the podium and she had a bottle of barbecue sauce and a condom. And she said, this is a condiment. This is for sex. This is not.